That boy doesn't know what he's looking at." Hector Voss said it loud enough for the whole room to hear, the way a man says a thing when he wants an audience and already has one. "Go on, son. Put your hand back in your pocket before you embarrass yourself further." The laughter came easy and quick, the way laughter does in a room full of people who have already decided how a story ends. Ezekiel Drummond did not look up from the table. He was 22 years old that October, lean the way a person gets when they have spent more years working than eating, with hands that were already older than the rest of him. He had driven 3 hours from Sudbury to get to this estate sale in Parry Sound, and he had not driven 3 hours to flinch at the sound of a man like Hector Voss. The table held the remains of the Alderton estate, pressed glass vases, a silver tea service gone gray at the joints, a stack of warped paperbacks, and at the far end, almost as an afterthought, the typewriter. It was a thing that no one else in the room had touched. Ezekiel had understood why the moment he walked in. The case was cracked along one side. The platen was off its rail. The ribbon housing had melted and rehardened into something that looked like a broken jaw, and the whole machine leaned slightly to the left, the way a thing leans when a piece of its foundation has given up. The tag taped to the case read $40, and someone had crossed that out and written $25. No one had crossed that out. The Alderton name meant something in Parry Sound the way old money names do. Not loudly, not with much warmth, but with a weight that had settled into the town over enough generations that people had stopped questioning it. Arthur Alderton had been a journalist. That was the word the sale organizer used when Ezekiel asked, "A journalist," and she said it the way people say a thing they know only in outline. He had died in March. There was no family left to inherit, and so the estate had gone to sale, and what was left of a man's life had been arranged on folding tables in the front room of a house that smelled of old paper and something else. Something Ezekiel recognized from his grandmother's house. The particular stillness of a room where no one had laughed in a long time. Ezekiel had come because of a listing. A private collector in Sudbury had sent a note to the repair shop where Ezekiel worked 3 evenings a week, fixing small machines, clocks, radios, the occasional typewriter. The collector had heard there might be an Underwood No. 5 in the Alderton sale. The Underwood No. 5 was not a rare machine, but it was a good one. And if this one had been Alderton's working typewriter, it might have history attached to it that mattered to the right person. The collector had offered to cover Ezekiel's gas and time if he went to look, and more if he brought the machine back in reasonable condition. The machine on the table was not in reasonable condition. It was, by any fair accounting, in terrible condition. But Ezekiel had picked it up and turned it in his hands, and he had heard the thing that his boss, a retired instrument repairman named Walter Fenn, always said a person heard if they listened before they judged. He had heard the mechanism underneath the damage. The damage was real. The damage was also not the machine. He had set it back down and reached for his wallet. That was when Hector Voss had spoken. Voss was the kind of man who filled rooms, not with warmth. He was broad across the shoulders and wore his money like a second coat, visible and a size too large. He had been moving through the sale with his hands behind his back and his chin slightly up. The way a man moves when he has already bought everything in the room in his head, before the prices have been settled. He had not touched the typewriter. He had not looked at it twice. But he had looked at Ezekiel twice, and something in what he saw had been enough. $25, Ezekiel said to the woman running the table. "Make it 15, she said, not unkindly. "Save yourself the trouble. 25 is fair," Ezekiel said, and put the bills on the table. Voss shook his head with the slow satisfaction of a man watching someone walk into a wall he could see from 50 feet away. "I know what that machine is, son. I bought one of Arthur Alderton's pieces for my office wall. Man had talent, I'll give him that. But that typewriter hasn't worked since the fire, and anyone who tells you different is selling you something. I'm not buying what anyone tells me," Ezekiel said. "Just the machine." There was a pause in the room. Not a long one. Then the laughter came again, thinner this time, uncertain whether it was laughing at the boy or at Voss, and that uncertainty made it meaner than it meant to be. Ezekiel wrapped the typewriter in the moving blanket he had brought and carried it out to his truck. The fire Voss had mentioned was not news to Ezekiel. He had looked up Arthur Alderton the night before, the way he looked up everything before he went somewhere, quietly and thoroughly. Alderton had been 63 when he died. He had worked for 40 years as a reporter, first for a regional paper in Muskoka, then freelance. The kind of freelance that is not a choice so much as a consequence. He had written about municipal corruption, about land deals that left the wrong people with less than they started with, about the particular bureaucratic silences that accumulate around things a town would rather not say aloud. He had not been famous. He had been, by every account Ezekiel could find, careful. That word kept appearing in descriptions of the man's work. Careful. He was a careful writer. He sourced things carefully. He was careful about what he published and more careful about what he kept. The fire had been 3 years ago. A small one. It had started in the storage room at the back of Alderton's house, where he kept his filing cabinets and his working machines, and it had taken the better part of that room before a neighbor called it in. The fire marshal's report said electrical. Alderton had told 2 people in the weeks after that he was not certain the fire marshal had looked as carefully as the evidence deserved. Then he had gone quiet on the subject, the way a careful man goes quiet when he is not ready to be heard. He had died 8 months ago of a stroke. He had died alone, which the obituary mentioned once and did not dwell on. Ezekiel had read all of this and had thought about it on the drive down the way he thought about things, steadily and without hurrying to a conclusion. He did not know what he expected to find. He was not certain he expected to find anything. But Walter Fenn had told him once that a person who only fixes what they can see coming never learns how to fix what matters, and Ezekiel had carried that sentence around long enough that it had become a way of moving through the world. He stopped for coffee in Parry Sound before the drive back, sitting in his truck in the parking lot of a Tim Hortons with the typewriter on the seat beside him, still wrapped in the blanket. His phone had a message from the collector in Sudbury, asking if he had found anything. Ezekiel wrote back that he had found the typewriter and would assess it when he got home. He did not say more than that because he did not know more than that. He drove the 3 hours back with the machine beside him like a passenger. The shop where Ezekiel worked evenings was a narrow room above a hardware store on Elm Street in Sudbury, which was not a coincidence he thought about often, but could not quite stop thinking about. Walter Fenn had built the shop over 30 years, filling it with the particular organized clutter of a person who could not walk past a broken mechanism without wondering whether it was only sleeping. There were shelves of parts organized by function rather than origin. There were 3 workbenches, each lit by a different quality of lamp. There was a shelf of manuals that Walter had spent decades assembling, and beside it a smaller shelf of notebooks in Walter's own hand, which Ezekiel had worked through slowly over 2 years and which were worth more than the manuals. Walter was not there when Ezekiel arrived that night. He was 71 and had been in and out of health since the spring, and Ezekiel had been managing the evening work mostly on his own. The key to the shop lived under a particular loose corner of the 3rd stair from the bottom, which was the kind of hiding spot that only works because no one bothers to look. He unwrapped the typewriter on the center bench and turned on the good lamp and looked at it properly for the first time. The damage was worse in good light, and he had already known the damage was bad. The right side of the carriage return mechanism had fused at some point from heat, which explained the lean. The platen was not merely off its rail, but had been replaced, poorly, with a platen from a different model, which was why it did not seat correctly. The ribbon housing was cracked through but not beyond repair if a person had the right gauge of housing material and enough patience. The type bars were intact, all 42 of them, which was where the machine's real value lived if it had any. He began at the outside and worked inward, the way Walter had taught him, not opening anything until he understood what he was opening, not moving a thing until he had a clear reason for the movement. The right side panel came off after 20 minutes of careful persuasion. Inside, the damage from the fire was visible as a kind of geography. a map of where the heat had been strongest and where it had not reached. The mechanism at the heart of it was older than the case suggested. Whoever had serviced this machine last had to replace the exterior components at some point, while leaving the interior largely original, which meant what Ezekiel was looking at in the center of the machine was a mechanism that had not been touched in perhaps 50 years, and tucked into the interior channel of the right side rail, held there by nothing more than the pressure of the housing panel that had been replaced over it, was an envelope. It was not large. It was not sealed. The flap had been folded in rather than gummed down, and the paper was brown at the edges from proximity to whatever heat had reached into the body of the machine without quite destroying what it found there. Someone had placed it carefully. It was not a thing that had fallen in by accident. Ezekiel did not open it immediately. He set it on the clean part of the bench and looked at it for a moment, the way Walter had taught him to look at things he did not yet understand, which was with patience and without touching. Then he went back to the mechanism. He worked for 2 hours on the carriage return assembly before he was satisfied that he understood what had been done to it and what could be undone. He cleaned the type bar guides with the finest brush on the shelf and found, as he had suspected from the feel of them when he first handled the machine, that they were in remarkable condition for their age. He sourced a replacement ribbon housing from the third shelf from the left, second section, where Walter kept Underwood parts in ascending order of age. He did not fix the platen that night. The platen required a decision about what the machine was going to be used for, and he did not know the answer to that yet. At close to midnight, with the mechanism cleaned and partially reassembled, and the lamp beginning to feel like the only warm thing in the room, he sat down on the stool and opened the envelope. Inside was a single four-folded sheet, and a smaller envelope tucked behind it. The sheet was a letter, and it was addressed to no one in particular, which Ezekiel understood immediately to mean it was addressed to whoever opened it. It was in Arthur Alderton's hand. He recognized the handwriting from a document he had found online the night before, a letter to the editor Alderton had written 20 years ago, and the shape of the letters was the same. Small, deliberate, with a particular way of forming the letter D that looked like a closed circle with a thought attached to it. He read it once and then sat still for a while. Then he read it again. The letter said that Arthur Alderton had spent 11 years working a story he had not been able to publish. It was a story about a land arbitration that had taken place in Muskoka in the early 90s, in which a parcel of reserve land adjacent to the eastern shore of 3 Mile Lake had been transferred out of the administration of a First Nations band council through a process that Alderton, in 11 years of working the documents, had become increasingly certain was not legal. The land had passed through 3 intermediary owners before being consolidated into a resort development that still operated under the name Lakeview Reach, a name that appeared in tourism advertising, in a way that made no mention of what the land had been before. Alderton had the documents. He had acquired them through access to information requests and through a source inside the Provincial Land Registry Office who had, he wrote, taken considerable personal risk to provide them. He had not published because the source had asked him not to, and because a man he named, a developer from North Bay named Gordon Pellerin, had made it known through channels that were difficult to trace that the story had better not appear. 3 weeks before the fire, Alderton had been told by his editor at the paper he had last worked for that they would not touch the story regardless of what the documents showed. The editor had not given a reason. He had not needed to. The fire, Alderton wrote, had not started in the storage room. He did not know how he could prove that to the satisfaction of a fire marshal who had not looked carefully. But the filing cabinet containing his primary documents had been the one thing in the storage room that had burned completely, while things around it, things that should have caught more easily, had not. He had kept a copy of the most important documents elsewhere. He was putting that copy, now inside the machine he had worked on for 40 years, because he was not certain what was happening to him or when. But he was a careful man, and a careful man makes sure the truth has more than one place to live. The smaller envelope held a USB drive. Ezekiel set the drive on the bench beside the letter and looked at both of them in the lamplight for a long time. He thought about what it would be easy to do. It would be easy to call the collector in Sudbury in the morning and report that the typewriter had been in worse shape than expected and was not the right machine. It would be easy to hand the drive to someone else and let that person decide. It would be easy to understand that he was 22 years old and had $25 and a borrowed shop key and no particular reason to be the person who carried this. He understood all of this. He also understood, sitting in Walter Fenn's shop at midnight with an old man's careful letter in his hands, that easy was not the same as right, and that the difference between the two was something he had known about, since he was young enough to have it used against him. He was the son of a woman named Ezekiel Drummond, who had worked 2 jobs for 11 years to keep Ezekiel and his younger sister in the same school district, because the school district mattered, and she knew it mattered, and she was not going to let the arithmetic of their circumstances take that from her children without a fight. His mother had a phrase she used when something difficult needed doing, and the available reasons not to do it were piling up. "You already know." She said it quietly, without drama. She said it the way a person says a thing that does not need proving. You already know. Ezekiel already knew. He photographed the letter and the USB drive and the envelope and the compartment where they had been hidden. He wrote down everything he had done to the machine in the order he had done it, the way Walter had taught him to document a repair, because a careful record was its own kind of protection. He put the letter and the envelope in a sealed plastic bag from the shelf near the door. He put the USB drive in a second bag. He locked both bags in the small fireproof cabinet, where Walter kept the most valuable parts, which took a specific key from the ring in the drawer, which Ezekiel locked back into the drawer. Then he finished the repair, because the machine deserved to be finished, and because a thing worth starting is worth completing. At 2 in the morning, in a quiet shop in Sudbury, the Underwood No. 5 that Arthur Alderton had typed on for 40 years typed again for the first time in 3 years. It was not perfect. The platen was still wrong and would need proper attention another day, but the type bars fell clean and true against the page, and the mechanism that Walter Fenn would have called the heart of it, the part that had outlasted a fire and a replacement, and 30 years of being ignored by people who only looked at the outside, was exactly what it had always been. Ezekiel typed one line on the sheet of scrap paper he had loaded. A careful man makes sure the truth has more than one place to live. He sat with that for a moment. Then he pulled the sheet out and folded it and put it in his breast pocket. In the morning, he called his cousin Adara, who had finished a journalism degree 2 years before and was working at a small outlet in Ottawa that Ezekiel had looked up and found, in the way he looked up everything, to be the kind of publication that had not, in 14 years of operating, killed a story because of who it might inconvenience. He told Adara that he had something she needed to see in person, and that it was not the kind of thing he wanted to describe on a phone. She drove to Sudbury the following weekend. She sat in the shop with the letter and the drive for 3 hours. She asked Ezekiel questions the way a careful person asks questions. Not quickly, not to fill silence, but to understand. She asked how he had come to buy the typewriter. She asked what he had done with the documents before calling her. She asked whether he had told anyone else. She did not ask whether he was certain the documents were real, because she had read the letter twice and she could see, the way a person trained to see such things can see, the difference between a careful man and a dishonest one. Then she sat quietly for a while, which Ezekiel took as a good sign, because a person who is not sure what they are holding needs noise, and a person who knows exactly what they are holding goes still. "This is going to take time to verify," she said. "I know," Ezekiel said. "It's going to make some people very uncomfortable." "I know that too. Why did you call me?" she asked, not suspiciously, but with the genuine curiosity of someone who understood that she was not the obvious choice. Ezekiel thought about that for a moment. "Because you don't kill things," he said. "I looked you up." Adora looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up the sealed bag with the drive. "I'm going to need to keep this." That's why I called you, Ezekiel said. It took 14 months. Adora's outlet published in 3 parts over as many weeks, working from the documents on the drive, which a provincial land registry expert and a retired land claims lawyer confirmed were authentic. The story was not simple, and the outlet did not pretend it was simple, which was part of why it was taken seriously. It named Gordon Pellerin, and named the intermediary transactions, and named the provincial official who had signed the arbitration transfer in 1993, with what the document suggested was incomplete information at best and something worse at worst. It named Arthur Alderton, and it described the fire, and it described what the fire had not managed to destroy, because a man had thought carefully about where the truth needed to live. Gordon Pellerin's lawyers issued a statement calling the reporting incomplete and misleading. They did not sue. A development that does not sue when it has the grounds to sue is, as Adora's editor noted in a note to staff, a development that has looked at the grounds and decided not to stand on them in public. The provincial government announced a review of the land arbitration process 3 weeks after the 3rd piece published. The review named an independent adjudicator. It would take years. These things always take years. But a process that has been buried for 30 years and has come back to the light does not easily go back into the ground. And the people who had the most to lose from the review knew that, and the people who had the most to gain from it knew it too. Hector Voss had not been named in the story. He had nothing to do with the story. He was simply a man who had been in a room in Parry Sound on a Saturday in October, and had said what he said in the way men like him say things, loudly, and with a certainty that has not been earned by looking carefully. By the time the stories ran, Ezekiel had not thought about Hector Voss in months. He thought about Arthur Alderton sometimes, on the drive home from the shop in the evenings. He thought about a man who had spent 11 years on a story he could not publish and who had kept working anyway, because careful people keep working even when the work cannot be seen. He thought about the way the machine had felt under his hands before he opened it, the way the heart of it had been intact in spite of everything that had been done to the outside of it, and how a person who only looked at the outside would have left it on the table for $15 less than the asking price and walked away satisfied. He still had the sheet of paper, with the single line he had typed at 2 in the morning. He had kept it folded in his breast pocket until the pocket wore through, and then he had put it flat in the drawer of his bench, which was a drawer he opened every evening when he started work. He did not read it every evening. He just knew it was there. Walter Fenn heard about the publication the way old men, who do not follow the news, hear about things, slowly and from several directions. And when the shape of it finally reached him, he came into the shop on a Tuesday afternoon and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at Ezekiel, who was restringing the action of a small upright piano someone had brought in from Chelmsford. That was the Alderton machine, Walter said. It was not a question. Yes, Ezekiel said. Walter was quiet for a moment. He had a particular kind of quiet that Ezekiel had come to recognize over 2 years, the quiet of a man assembling something in his before he said it. Your father, Walter said carefully, had a name for the thing you did. Not the fixing, the other part. He paused. He would have said you listened before you judged. Ezekiel went still. Walter did not speak about Ezekiel's father often. Ezekiel's father had died when Ezekiel was 4, and the shape of him existed in Ezekiel's life, mostly in the second-hand accounts of people who had known him, accounts that Ezekiel had collected carefully over the years the way he collected everything. Steadily and without hurrying to a conclusion. Walter had known him. Walter had known him well enough to have worked beside him, briefly before the man had left Sudbury for the job that had taken him south and the accident that had never brought him back. He worked with his hands, Walter said, not looking at Ezekiel now but at the piano. Same kind of hands, patient hands, the kind that know how to wait for a thing to tell you what it needs. Ezekiel did not say anything. He had a great deal of practice in not filling silences that were still working. I should have told you more, Walter said. I kept it to myself because I thought it was mine to keep, but it wasn't. He turned and looked at Ezekiel directly. and there was something in the old man's face that had given way. Quietly and without drama, the way ice gives way in March. Not all at once, but in the particular moment when its own weight becomes more than it can hold. He would have been proud of you. I know that as surely as I know anything. The shop was very quiet for a moment. Show me what you did to the carriage return, Walter said finally. I want to understand the approach, and Ezekiel showed him. The Underwood no. 5 was donated eventually to the Muskoka Journalism School that had named its annual Ethics Award for Arthur Alderton in the spring following the publication. It sat in the glass case in the main hall with a small card explaining where it had been found and what had been found inside it, and students walked past it every day on their way to classes in rooms that bore names Alderton would not have recognized but would, Ezekiel thought, have approved of. He had been asked to speak at the naming ceremony, which surprised him, and he had stood in the front of a room full of people who were mostly older than him and said something he had not prepared, which was unusual for him, but which came up out of him from somewhere that felt true. He said that the story had not been his to find so much as his to not miss. He said that the difference between a thing that is lost and a thing that is waiting is almost always the person looking, and whether they are looking at the outside or listening for what's underneath it. He said that he had paid $25 for a broken machine at a sale in Parry Sound because it had sounded to him like something that still had something to say. He said he hoped everyone in the room had something in their lives that they were willing to look at long enough to hear. He did not say anything about Hector Voss. There was no need. The room full of people who were mostly older than him would not have known the name. And besides, a man who looks at the price of a thing and calls it the truth of a thing has already answered the only question that matters about him. Ezekiel took the train back to Sudbury that evening. The window of the train car showed him the Shield country going dark in the way it goes dark in late autumn. Slowly and without apology, the rock and the birch and the long water settling into themselves for the season. He had a coffee he had bought at the station and the typed sheet of paper in his jacket pocket, which had moved into a new pocket when the old one gave out, and which would move again when this one did. The next morning he opened the shop, unlocked the drawer, and went to work.